human understanding as an end. And from the last stanza, we know that eternity as the final destination of the death of journey, and through the line since then 'tis centuries and yet feels shorter than a day. The use of the present simple form of feels seems to show the continuity of the speaker's existence with eternity. So from this viewpoint of eternity, the qualification of each past century as shorter than the day of the speaker's death, life is something that one does not need to regret or to feel sorrow about. Another theme in the poem is the cyclical nature of life and the death. The journey format of the poem mimics the way that life itself is from the birth to death, from the arrival of new life to its absence. The observations that the speaker makes along the journey seem to reinforce the idea life and death are in cyclical balance. In a way, the poems also suggest that life is not possible without death. And there are many hints in the poem show the circular transformation from life to nothingness and from life to nothingness once more. For example, like the I had put away my leisure and my labor too. Then we have the last scene, the afterlife. Actually, this poem raises questions about what happens after one dies. And it also relates to the Emily Dickinson's Christian belief of the afterlife, that one attains immortality for the blessings of God, hinting that death is not the end. So now we are going to look at the language, form, and the tone of this poem. Emily Dickinson uses many symbols in the poem, like the carriage in the first stanza, which is the mode of transportation to the afterlife. Also symbolize the coffin, which carries dead body, and the children, the school, the fields of gazing grain, and the setting sun in the third stanza signified three general stages of human life. And the childhood is represented by the children and the school. Adulthood and maturity is represented by the fields of gazing grain. And the end of life is symbolized by the setting sun. Another two important symbols, the rain and the grain. In this stanza, children play in the rain, a circular shape, which hints symbolically at the idea of life and death as a cyclical relationship. And as for the grain, crops are brought to maturity each year and then cut down to be sold. So in other words, it carries a cycle of new life and death, just like the human world. And then let's turn to the description of the speaker's dressing in the fourth stanza. My gown, conscious then a dress, wear a dress using by a woman in life, not in the party, so must be wear in procession of and the death. So we have one theory is that the speaker is dead, but it doesn't state explicitly in the poem instead of illustrating the way she dresses. Another is that the speaker was as likely as dressed for the marriage. Death ceases to be an end in this poem and become a fresh new start. So death is not seen any longer a tragic event, rather it becomes a happy one. Finally, a house in the stanza 5 symbolizes the grave as the place where human body rests after death. As we all know that house is a place which is safe, warm, peaceful. Here, maybe Emily Dickinson tries to change the image of a grave that is cold, dark, and scary. Then we are going to look at the alliteration in this poem. Emily Dickinson uses many in the poem, such as school, stove, recess, ring, gazing green, and the setting sun. Another thing is the repeated phrase at the beginnings of line 1, 3, and 4 of stanza 3. This repetition of a word or phrase throughout the poem is called a nephra, and it's a technique poets use a lot in order to help the poem progress as well as tie it together. Injectment means a line is cut off before its natural stopping point and forces a reader down to the next line and the next quickly. In this point, for example, the carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too. Caesura is a pause into the middle of a line, such as at recess in the ring. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. And next, death is very clearly personified from the first stanza. He acts as the speaker's suitor, encouraging her to get into the carriage and ride with him into the unknown world. He is both kind and civil to the speaker, and it is very different from his classic image. Emily Dickinson also uses paradox in her poem. In the last stanza, century is a very long time, but how can it become so short like a day? And she also uses two kinds of imagery, tactile touch imagery and the visual imagery. About the form of this poetry, because I could not stop for this, is a 6-stanza poem that is divided into sets of 4 lines, known as quatrains. And it follows the traditional pattern found in most of Dickinson's poems, ballad meter. This means that the first and third lines of each verse are made up of 4 pairs of 2 beats for a total of 8 syllables. The first of these beats is unstressed and the second is stressed. This is known as iambic tetrameter. And the second and fourth lines of each verse also use iambs, but there are only 3 pairs of 2 beats in each line. This is known as iambic trimeter. The lines alternate between these 2 metrical patterns throughout the poem. And last, we are going to look at the rhyme scheme of this poem. This poem follows a loose rhyme scheme of ABCB, like me and immortality in the first stanza. However, Dickinson used a variety of rhymes in one poem. She is a poet who is more concerned with the perfect words than the perfect rhyme. As a traditional norm, rhyme can not only give poetry a sense of rhythm and music, but also become a restriction. So Dickinson didn't feel obliged to use exact rhyme and often adapted conventional rhyming patterns. For example, in this poem, me rhymes with immortality and farther down the civility and eternity. Scattering this same rhyme unevenly throughout the poem really ties the sound of the poem together. Still, though away and civility in stanza 2 is not a rhyme, the sound pattern is echoed nicely in the final stanza with day and eternity. And Dickinson also uses slant rhymes, like chill and chill in the stanza 4. Half or slant rhyme means that they sound really close to a perfect rhyme, but there is something little off. So now I will pass time to my partner Yingxin again. Let her introduce our last part today, how poetry and because I could not stop for this can be used in language education.
Okay, now I was wondering that Have your teacher ever put the poetry as a learning material in your middle school or in your university? Maybe I guess most of you get to appreciate the poetry in your university more or less. So today I will share 3 points about the poetry that can be used in English classroom. First is that poetry is the mirror of human's life. They are authentic materials based on our real contexts so that students could have a good taste of and think about each aspect of our life, like study, work, family, etc. And here I take this point as an example. Students could share how they treat death according to their experiences or based on what they have seen, what they have heard from other places or other people. So this process is called talking with thinking. And next one, poetry is also a reflection of a diversity of culture. Different poems are written under different social backgrounds so that students could get to know different cultures and enhance their intercultural ability. This poem written by Emily Dickinson was in the Victorian era. So students could get the features of the industrial revolution, like technological advancement. And what's more, teachers could introduce the culture of death in China and Western countries. And they can also educate them how to treat death in the right way. And the third one, poetry will be beneficial to students' language enrichment. Some lexical or syntactic items will act as input for students, and some short quotes from the poetry will be memorable enough and students could keep them in their mind without any efforts. So some vocabularies in these poems like haste, civility, quiver, and surmise, and I also put some useful lines in this poetry, like I had put away my labor and my leisure, the dews drew quivering and shrill, and all these vocabularies and sentences can be used to foster students' speaking and writing abilities. So all in all, I think it is very significant for students to get to know poetry in their English classroom. Okay, and that's all for our presentation. Thank you for listening.